Acri, where we are designing a digital archive portal that will connect families' collections to institutional collections and kind of put them at a level playing field. I think what is very appealing to individuals and families about community archives is that it's this opportunity to be seen, this opportunity to be recognized as having something to contribute of value. I think particularly, and again, I'm really talking about the context of Macri and the project we're working on, but I think this is true for a lot of community archives, that one of the inspirations behind so many community archives is that oftentimes within our communities, we've been conditioned to think that we don't have anything of historical value, that we don't have anything to, for example, offer to the National Archive or to, you know, some kind of grand institution like that. But again, I really think that is the result of a kind of a conditioning where for so many years we have been undervalued and kind of trained to think that what we do, what our families do, what we as individuals do in the community doesn't have a larger importance. But I think that what in fact we know is that idea that our documents don't carry importance or that we don't have knowledge of important events. And in reality, we've been organizing communities, we've been educating children in a climate of pervasive prejudice. We've been committing numerous acts of philanthropy and aids of our communities. All of this stuff that's generally not acknowledged outside of our communities. I think a lot of this is about being able to see that what our communities have been doing is just as important. So if you think about a lot of like institutional archives and where those collections come from, oftentimes those collections do come from people wielding a lot of power or people who come from great wealth. And so, you know, it almost like plants this false idea into our heads that it's only those people of great power, you know, former presidents all have their own like presidential library and archive, right? That we think that people of great power, people of great wealth are the ones that have the stuff that's of value to save. But in fact, that's just one aspect of history, right? There's a whole, in fact, probably larger body of history that represents just working people. And so this is an opportunity to be seen. The community archives are an opportunity for individuals and families to be seen, to have the kind of work that people do at a community level be recognized as important.
Great, thank you so much for that. And so as we think about this opportunity, let's zero in on the focus of this session. And how would you guide someone who says they want to begin imagining a community archive? Do you have any tips on how someone might define the project, how they might begin it? And I guess putting this another way, what are some ways that you can take this idea and make it a reality?
Right. Okay, I just want to say there's probably not a one-size-fits-all answer to this. I think that a lot of community archives have been the result of almost like we were accidentally community archiving and we didn't know it. And, you know, and then, but not all of them happen that way. Some of them are much more thought out and intentional, but I think some of them, particularly for organizations that have existed for a long time, they may have just in the course of their existence created records of their activities. And then, you know, 20 years later, somebody says, wow, you know, it would be cool to do some kind of website or presentation or exhibit that showcases, you know, this 20 years of community work that you've been doing. And so then maybe that plants the seed of, oh, we have an archive here. But I think if you're starting from scratch, a good place would be, as you said, to define it. I would suggest And it doesn't have to be something you put out to the whole world if that gives you anxiety, but at least internally kind of come up with a mission statement. We are going to do X. What is it? What is this topic that you want to capture? What will the scope of the collection be? So for example, if you wanted to capture the work, let's just take the recent pandemic, for example. If you wanted to capture these little like community pantries that have been popping up in San Antonio, and you wanted to capture that history, then you would, maybe write a little sort of mission statement saying we are going to collect stories around community pantries in the years, 2020 to 2021 in San Antonio. I know that sounds very specific, but in a way that's a good starting point to be very specific. And that way you have a focus and you don't get too, distracted by other cool ideas, but you want to try to make a narrow definition of what it is you're trying to capture, what the scope will be. So if you're looking for that community pantry history, just as an example, well, maybe you want to do oral histories with people who started community pantries. Maybe you want to try to get a photograph of every community pantry you've been able to find out about in San Antonio. Maybe you want to create some kind of map about where they are. But what is the content going to be? Even if it's aspirational content, like maybe you can't get something you want, but you can put it on your wish list, right? I think it's okay to be a little bit flexible about some of that stuff, so you might think, right now, you might think, oh, we'll just focus on oral histories and photographs. But then a few months into the project, you might realize that somebody has, for example, flyers that they were putting out. Well, maybe now you want to start also collecting flyers about those community pantries or something like that. So it's okay to be a little bit flexible, but you don't want to be entirely open-ended, because next thing you know, you'll be all over the place, and so you'll kind of lose your focus, right? So a little bit flexible, but also focused. You also want to really think about, and this may evolve, but you want to think about, at least for the here and now, what is our capacity to do this project? Are we going to have a volunteer team? Are we going to be able to hire somebody? Are we going to, how are we going to store these things that we're collecting? Is this something where we want to create, like, can we get a Dropbox account to store all of these digital files? Or in fact, are we taking physical things and therefore we need some safe place to put those physical things? If you're partnering, for example, with some community nonprofit, and maybe they'll give you a little space to file things away, maybe they'll give you access to some server space, but just remember, everything takes space, whether it's physical documents or digital documents. Digital files also require space in the cloud or on some server. Better yet, with digital files, you kind of want to keep them in multiple places if you can, just in case something goes down. But so you want to think about, well, what's your capacity? Do you want to partner with some other organization, or are you already some organization and this little community archive is sort of a side project of the organization? Do you want this to be a totally independent community project, not partnering with any institution because you don't want to have any constraints? That's okay too, but just you kind of need to know, what can we do if that's what we're planning to do. How many hours do you think this is going to take? Because if this is going to be a volunteer run project, let your volunteers know, we think this is going to require 2 to 3 hours a week. What you don't want to happen is, so for example, your volunteers to say, I can't do any more of this, and then suddenly you have no more volunteers helping you. If you're partnering with another organization, do you have some kind of agreement with them that somebody at that organization is going to help you with, say, the cataloging for 4 hours a month or something like that? So again, you just sort of, have some sense of expectations, but also recognize that you don't necessarily have to figure everything out from the beginning. Some of this can evolve, and there's also different sort of levels for just how complicated do you want this to be. Because, for example, if you are just going to be scanning people's photographs, or you're just going to be doing digital recordings of oral histories, and I don't mean just as in that's not a big deal, that's still a lot of work, but those things, if they're digital files, you could create a blog where you just are posting those things on the blog. You could create a history pin page, which is, it's a little bit like Pinterest, but it's with a map, and you locate places. And so you could tag a photo to a particular location and then write in the little story about that image. It could absolutely, if you're working with digital images, it could be an Instagram page. A great example of that is ATX Barrio Archive on Instagram, where this guy is posting these old vintage photos of Mexican-American Austin. And so it was just like really easy on the user end to just scroll through it. But also, even on his end, it's not super complicated in terms of he's not the one paying for the digital storage space. He's just sort of putting those things out there with the story behind them. Having said that, if Instagram ever were to go out of business, I'm not sure what his backup is. So those are things to just consider if you want to use a proprietary platform, which might be super easy. They could also go out of business. I mean, I'm just thinking of Tumblr, for example. For a long time, Tumblr was super popular, and in a way, Tumblr was a little bit like a kind of like a visual archive option. But Tumblr has been sold a couple of times, and it's sort of I don't think it's getting any support anymore. And so, that's an issue. And then somebody just mentioned in the chat privacy. That's absolutely true. If you are taking things from people, whatever the format is of what they're giving you, and whatever the format is that you plan to put this out there to the public, you need to have some kind of release form signed, which is them basically saying, we're giving you permission to put this out into the public. And in some cases, that's a little tricky, because just because I have a photograph in my possession doesn't mean I actually own the rights to it. I will say that I think that the world of that, particularly in this age of social media, is such that oftentimes we do that thing where we just put it out there, and then if somebody else has to take it down, we apologize and take it down. So I guess it depends on how risk averse you are. But sometimes it's just very complicated to figure out, well, who exactly does own the rights to this? If it's your family photo, I think you probably are in the clear to give the image to a community archive and just sign something saying, I'm giving the community archive permission to use this in the public. But it can be complicated. The other thing, just going back to steps. Okay, so first step, define what it is that you're trying to capture. What is the scope of your community archive going to be, both in terms of topic as well as in terms of format? So are we collecting oral histories? Are we collecting photographs? Are we collecting, I don't know, newspaper clippings? What types of things are we collecting? And that will help you figure out what kind of storage you need, whether it's digital storage or physical storage. Just remember, all things, whether it's digital or physical, also needs to be taken care of. So I pulled this out from the bookcase to show you. I have this old box, which maybe is from college. It's covered. This is one of my undergrad years, covered in stickers. It's full of floppy disks, and I don't know what's on here, but I'm not going to be able to access it anytime soon. So when somebody gives you something, if it's a digital file, and think, oh, it's cool, it's safe, it's on a digital file, but technology is constantly evolving. So like those things are no longer really useful. Honestly, if oftentimes the physical thing is going to like a physical printout will last longer in many cases than a digital file. So sometimes it's nice to have both. There are, you know, some digital formats that are considered more long lasting, or there's ways to migrate digital files from one format to another to something that's more up to date. But again, technology just moves at lightning speed. So you need to be ready to evolve. Okay, so I'm so sorry, I keep going off topic. Define your scope, your mission statement. What is it that you're trying to do? Then I would suggest kind of like a community survey, community outreach. You want to have, I would say, you know, talk to the community about whoever your community is as you're defining it for your project. Talk to people within that circle to figure out what are the pros and cons to different approaches. Because if you're thinking, maybe we'll just do like an Instagram page, but maybe it turns out that some of the people who are involved in your project, they don't know what Instagram, they don't do Instagram, you know, so you can think about, well, who is our audience? Because is Instagram going to hit our audience, or is our audience more like people who would like to see a photo exhibit at the local senior center? And if so, like how can we, you know, how can we approach the local senior center to do that? But then also, how do we make sure that when we've been capturing, like if we've been scanning things from people's collections, did we scan them at a quality that we can print them out to do some kind of display at the senior center? So just keep things in mind like that. So you want to sort of like do a survey of who your community is, what would be most useful to them. You probably also at that point, once you know what your topic is and kind of what you want to do with it, I would start Googling to see, okay, are there other collections that are already doing this? Not to say that you can't do it in some unique way that's different than what they're doing, but maybe you can glean some ideas from what's already there, or maybe it will even help you sort of narrow down your focus a little bit. But what else is out there? What hole would we be filling with this project? And what kinds of things could we collect that don't already exist in other places? So for example, maybe there are, maybe there's lots of photos about something that you're interested in collecting, but maybe there's not a lot of firsthand stories. So maybe then you focus on oral histories for your project. But, you know, just sort of doing that sort of surveying thing to figure out what is the hole we'd be filling and how do we fill that in order to address what our community is looking for, what our community can access easily. You might also just start thinking about how exactly are we going to go about collecting these things? Do we already have this network of people who we have relationships with, who trust us? We can then do kind of like history harvest with those folks. Or do we in fact need to do more community outreach? And I would say, even if you have sort of like a starter community that will be contributing to the archive, it's probably never too early to start doing outreach beyond that to see, well, what else is there? And you can ask the people who are already engaged, can you recommend somebody else who's not connected with us yet? Because they might have other contacts with similar types of information that you're looking for. You probably also want to start thinking about, okay, well, if we're going to be working with this community, what's in it for them? Like, do they get to become part of, officially, do they get to become part of the project? Do they get to become part of a advisory council? In fact, I mean, is this going to be very sort of casual, like we're this community club or community collective, or is this going to be a little bit more formalized? Like, do you want to become maybe a 501c3 and put some of those community people on the board? It doesn't have to be that formalized, but if it, for some reason, if you feel like that's the way to go, you should just sort of be thinking about that. But how are you bringing in people, how are you building trust with the community that is going to be contributing to the archive? And then of course, how are people actually going to see these things that you're collecting? And you know, initially in your planning stages, that may not be your first priority, right? Your first priority may be people in the community who are involved in X are dying out. We want to make sure we capture the stories of whatever that was. I mean, a good example might be COPS Metro. So COPS, a lot of their papers are actually at the UTSA archive. But a lot of the people who were involved in the early days of COPS are getting up there in age. And in fact, we've already lost quite a few. So if you wanted to do for example, like a oral history community archive just on former COPS members or even current COPS members, maybe the priority is just collecting those stories before those folks pass on, right? But the second thing is, okay, you collected the stories, now what? How will people access them? Maybe you create a web page, maybe it's just, honestly, maybe it's a YouTube page and you just put all those like video interviews with them on some YouTube page. You know, do consider how are they going to be accessed and what's the easiest way that people can get access to them. And also on your end, like maybe you love the idea of having this fancy website with background on the topic, as well as access to the oral histories and access to photos. And it could be so pretty, but do you know how to do that? Is that something you can do with like Wix or one of these, you know, sort of drag and drop platforms? Or do you in fact need to hire somebody who knows how to do code? And do you have any money to pay for that? Or would it just be easier and more realistic if you just decided, hey, let's just use YouTube and create a YouTube page? Or I don't know. I mean, so you just want to sort of think about what's your capacity? But certainly, I think you don't want to wait too long to start thinking about how is the public going to access this. And then I mentioned this already, but I just want to say it again. The technology keeps changing. So like you might think, yeah, YouTube is going to be great. We'll just use YouTube for this collection right now. But then let's say in 5 years, YouTube decides to start charging you per megabyte of video. You know, what will happen then? That doesn't mean you have to have your plan B ready from the get-go, but you should just understand that things will probably evolve with the technology because they constantly are changing. But okay, so just to recap, you want to define your project, you want to kind of do a survey of what's out there, what hole would we be filling, what does the community want to see happen with this project, and then additional outreach. 3 would be additional outreach to continue to build that community to help contribute to your project and be invested in its success.
Great, thank you so much. You offer a framework that's both very inspiring and very daunting. And it also is a great teaser, of course, for our session on the 6th. So we'll be talking about details more pointedly. But I think we're probably all beginning to think about those details, but just to reflect what you're saying, the earlier we do that, the better. So let me shift gears just a little bit, because I know, Dr. Gould, that you and I, when we've talked about such projects, one of the things we've always talked about is how community archives are really thinking about the user. Can you say a little bit more about how thinking about the user, particularly as you envision a community archive project, can really be another part of your framework?
Right, absolutely. I think that the user is one of the most important aspects of community archives. We know there's all kinds of institutional archives out there, and they've got great stuff in them. But for a variety of reasons, many people who are not already somehow attached to a university or familiar with government record keeping are not necessarily just going to walk into an institutional archive and start digging around. I mean, you have to make an appointment, you have to register with them, all these things. And it, it, I hope people know that archivists aren't really that scary, and you should go and do that if that sounds interesting to you. There's no reason why you can't make that appointment and go and see those things. However, I do think that the concept of community archives is that they're created at the community level for the community, and that there is no barrier to access. That's the goal. The goal is to have no barriers to access, and for the community to feel like this is our collection, like, that this is telling our stories, and we have a say. And not only, X topic is important to us and we want to see that story collected, but also then we want to be able to learn about it easily without super complicated processes. So I think that that accessibility issue is really central to thinking about effective, successful community archives. So you might think about, depending on how complicated your community archive is, or the capacity that you have, perhaps you have kind of two levels of your archive. So maybe behind the scenes, you have some kind of database that is organizing all of your collections, and there are multiple different platforms out there that you can get for organizing that kind of content. But then on the user end, on the public side of things, maybe the information is now being fed into a very user-friendly website. So that on the user end, if they're familiar with using Google, more or less that's the same process they would use to search the user side of your collection, if it were digital. But I think what you want to do is really, in that sort of organizing process for the archive, talk to your community about, okay, so we're going to be collecting oral histories on the community pantries that came out of the pandemic. When we collect those stories, when we collect photos of the different community pantries around town, how do you want to find that information? Do you want it to be on a website? Do you want us to have some kind of display at a local place where people can just wander in and physically see it without having to get online? And 1 second, I have to plug in my computer. Sorry about that. Okay. I don't want my computer to die on you. And then you might also ask them, would it make sense for it to be like a blog? It could be as opposed to, so traditional archives, it's more kind of like a library catalog in the sense that you get information about each individual item in the collection. But maybe your users would prefer that it be more like stories written around groupings of items in the collection. So maybe there's a story that centers on 5 or 6 images that you've collected, and somebody just writes, kind of an entry about, here's the background on these 5 images and the event that they capture. And then it's more kind of, again, like a blog, even it could be a newsletter, and every newsletter has a different topic. So this is the story of the Sanchez family, and here are the things that they donated to the archive and the story behind them. So it could be, in a variety of ways for the user to receive it. Again, on the back end, you might still have a more traditional kind of database, just capturing everything that's been contributed, what it is, where it came from, the date, etc. But the user end doesn't have to be that traditional. The user end can be much more creative if you want it to be. Again, you could use Instagram, you could use something like something narrative. I mean, I suppose if you're particularly creative, you could even use something like TikTok, but just think about talking to the community about how do you want to access this? What are you comfortable with? Because you might find that a lot of folks, I think it is true. A lot of folks are very familiar with the format of using something like Google, so sort of a search engine. So you could type in perhaps a family's name or a specific location, and then anything that was collected could come up. Now that requires that on the back end, somebody was inputting all those search terms connected to each one of those items, right? So that metadata thing. But I think what you want to do is figure out what's a format that is going to have sort of the lowest barrier to access. And it's going to depend on your community, right? Because if your community is, for example, if you were working on a project where you're trying to collect stories from, I don't know, the teenage experience of COVID, they're probably quite tech savvy. But if the goal is to collect stories from like that generation that is now passing on from the early cops era, I don't know. I mean, some of them might be quite tech savvy and some of them might not. So maybe you want to do a combination of things. Maybe you want to do the kind of newsletter concept that summarizes stories and showcases specific items in the collection along with the search portal. So, again, consider who your audience is and what their needs are.
Those are great suggestions. Can I ask one final question before we turn things over to the audience, because I'm sure they have questions in the time remaining. But I think one thing that might be illustrative as we conclude our conversation today is another topic that we've discussed is the blueprint that Mockry's using to envision a community archive. So would you share with us just how we might use blueprint as a way to think about everything you've shared with us today? And then I'd like to turn things over to the audience for questions.
Right. So at Mockry, we are creating, we're still in the planning stages, and so that's why we're developing this blueprint. But the goal is to have a digital archive portal where it would, on the user side of it, you would go on the web, you would be able to search for particular terms, but also we would have curated collections. So if you don't know where to start, you could just click on a little picture that says something about voting rights or a picture about labor rights, some topic related to our mission. So I will tell you, we're fortunate in that our mission has made it very clear to us what our collecting scope is. So we focus on Mexican American civil rights history. So our collecting scope is defined as we only collect within the realm of Mexican American civil rights history. However, there's multiple topics in there, right? So we're planning on having this portal that you can go to, and you can either search it or you can select curated topics and find documents in there. Having said that, and I mentioned this last week, but for those who maybe missed it, our goal is not necessarily to physically own very much of what is in that digital portal. What we want to do is connect to institutions that already have some archival records connected to Mexican American civil rights history. And so we would simply link to those. So for example, say there's some stuff relevant to Mexican American civil rights history at the UTSA archive, we would just explain what it is, say this is in the UTSA collection, and maybe we'd have a thumbnail of it, or a tiny image of it, but then you would just click on it in order to see it at UTSA's page. But that way you don't have to search every university archive, right? You can just go to this one portal for Mexican American civil rights history. On top of that though, we know that a lot of families do have things in their possession that are relevant to this topic, but they want to keep it in the family, right? It's a family heirloom. So the idea here is to digitize those things that families have. The families get to keep the item itself, and we just put a digital copy on the portal. There are, in a few instances, some people who have told us, we need to downsize, we want you to have this, but we're really trying to limit that to just a small sliver of the overall collection that will be in this digital archive. Now, even though we knew what the scope was because of our mission statement, this blueprint project that we're working on is helping us make some very important decisions, and they're decisions that basically any new archive is going to need to figure out. But what platform are we going to use to store this data? There are many different platforms out there. Some of them are so-called open source, meaning you need to know a bit of code in order to maintain them. Some of them are not. They're totally already built out. But of course, the risk with those ones is that if they go out of business or they get bought out and shut down, then you're going to have to migrate to something else. I will say these days, a lot of those companies kind of understand that if you're going to make the commitment to them, they need to have a way for you to easily migrate the data out if anything for some reason changes. But part of the blueprint is doing an analysis of the different platforms that are out there, and then looking at, we've been having lots of conversations with stakeholders in the portal. So we've been meeting with other archivists as well as other families that have things to figure out, okay, what kind of stuff do you have that might be good material for this portal, and what format is it? How many items are we talking about? Because we also have to consider the space, and again, digital space is not free. And then also, where exactly are we going to store all of this information? And on the user side of it, what's the most friendly platform? I feel like what I have learned in this process is that I'm not a good judge of what is user friendly. And I think it's because I've been using archives and libraries for too long. And so I have a familiarity with how to search an archives website that not necessarily everybody else has. And so what I have found in this process is that examples that of other archive portals that I thought were very user friendly, I'm learning from families that we've been talking to that they find them confusing. So that's important to know, right? Because I want to know then, okay, then what is a platform that we can use that is user friendly, even if you've never done archival research before, right? That's like, that's a different perspective than what I have, because I think I'm not a good judge at this point. So I need to trust what other people tell me. And so we've been asking people, what are things that you have that you think would be relevant? What are some like websites that you have gone to that you find to be really easy to navigate? And then we do show them some other examples to get their feedback to see, and I don't, does this seem easy to you? Do you want to play around with this and see if you can find what you're looking for? That blueprint is something that is not ready yet. It'll be ready next year, early next year, I hope. But the idea with that blueprint is that it will help us narrow down what platform we want to go with in terms of initially building it. And hopefully, it'll also just demonstrate to potential partners in the portal how easy it would be for them to contribute items to it. And again, the goal here is not for us to own these things. The goal is for families to keep ownership of things. All they would be doing essentially is giving us a licensing agreement to put the image of it online. But to me, it's important that families that have managed to hold on to things like that be able to keep them as long as they want them. If at some point they decide we do want to downsize, well, then we'll figure something out. But I just think that particularly for communities of color, working class communities, being able to hold on to documents is so challenging. Documents do tend to be more fragile than we would like them to be. And so, that's important to me, that we try to keep things in community hands.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Gould. You've given us so many ideas, and I'm sure some people in the audience want to follow up. The one thing that I would ask is that you do raise your hand, and that will put you to the front of the audience, and then we can call on you for questions. So does anyone have a question for Dr. Gould? Claudia, please go ahead and unmute and ask your question. And thank you for getting us started.
Hi, Dr. Gould. I hope you're doing well. I really enjoyed this presentation. I did have a quick question. When we're talking about having the shared rights between the community and the community archive, do you have a specific platform that you could share with us of where to even begin to look for these types of policies?
Yeah. So I think that increasingly within the world of museums and archives, there's this interest in what's called shared authority. And so that's the idea that whoever the creator of something was gets to have some say in how that thing might be used by some other entity that is interested in preserving that thing and showcasing it to the public. We see a lot of examples of this in Native American communities. A lot of tribes have been working with different museums and archives so that collections that are there get treated in a way that the community that created it feels is appropriate, and those things get used in a way that the community that created it feels is appropriate. And what we're starting to see now is more and more situations where something might live at a museum or archive, but then the community that created it can bring it back to the community for particular ceremonies or some kind of commemorative thing. But that idea that, yes, it shouldn't only live in that institution because that's like not its natural home. On the one hand, it's a safe place for it, but it's not its natural home. So I think we're learning a lot from those indigenous groups that have been working with museums and archives. Having said that, this concept of licensing is not really new. That idea that a family could have something, allow the image of it to be used by somebody else and for particular purposes, right? Like you would want to put into that agreement, and I can maybe put, I'm sorry, I don't have it easily accessible right now, but I have a sample of one of these licensing agreements that I can maybe provide to you. But it's just, the idea is just that it's for educational purposes, and that that you're not handing over any rights to it. It's just that we are showing it for educational purposes. But it's becoming more common. I think one of the museums that one of the archives that I've been looking at a lot in terms of hours is actually in Houston, at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. They have what's called the Hill Archive, and it's an archive about Texas decorative arts from like the I want to say 1800s to early 1900s. Most of what's in that collection, and this is a digital archive, most of what's in that digital archive does not belong to the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, but the Museum of Fine Arts Houston does have some Texas decorative arts. And so they wanted kind of this place where they could connect, like, all of the traditional chairs made by such and such artist. And having that allows them to connect to other museums that have personal collections, as well as when it comes to decorative arts, a lot of decorative arts are actually in people's private homes. And so people are offering to put photographs and whatever information they have about these things in that archive, but nothing actually leaves the possession of the person who has the original thing, right? It's just this licensing agreement that allows the Hill archive to put an image and information about it up on the site. And then that way, if you're interested in a particular, Texas folk artist, you can find out, there are, 20 known examples of this particular type of thing that he or she made. I can send you something for a sample if you're interested.
That's great. And I don't know if you're getting a chance to read these comments, but everyone is saying how helpful your information has been and expressing their gratitude. And I think, and I'd like to echo that as well. If we have one more question, we can probably take it. I would ask you to unmute and raise your hand. Do we have one final question from anyone?
Hi, I do. Hello. I was just wondering if there's any way I can be a part of our guest speakers archive project, or like an intern or a volunteer. I was just wondering about that.
We're not quite, we're still so much in the planning stages. We don't quite have an opportunity for that just yet. I'm very hopeful that next school year we will. But if you go to our website, which is somosmacri.org, hopefully by next year we'll have more opportunities for interns and volunteers. One of the things that sort of the nitty gritty, I think we'll talk probably about this next time, but like the nitty gritty of archiving is honestly a lot of data entry. And it's not necessarily the most fun aspect, but without that data entry, your digital files are just sort of lost in the ether. So that's the sort of thing where we could potentially down the road train folks, and that's just something that anybody who's thinking about a future in archives are going to need to know how to do that.
Great. And I think that is a wonderful place to wrap up, because I really think it captures the way you inspire audiences, Dr. Gould. I think we're all inspired to think more about archiving and community archives and thinking about users and more. I do want to point out that we put somosmacri.org in the chat. So if you want to go to that website and contact Dr. Gould, that's probably the best way to do that. And then if you have additional questions, please put them on the side, and know that we're all coming back together on December 6th in a couple weeks. We're keeping the 1 to 2 time slot, and again on December 13th. You can also find all of the Democratizing Racial Justice events on our Instagram and social media feeds. And I want to conclude first and foremost by thanking Dr. Gould. You're such an engaging speaker, and you have so much insight, and I think we all appreciate it as is being said in the comments. And then I also want to thank the entire DRJ team for both this project and all the work that's being done. Thank you all of you for joining us. This could not be done without having you in attendance, and we hope to see you in a few weeks.
Thank you.